arrives. First of all, it's a pleasure to have you. It's good to
Thank
see you
you.
again. We appreciate the fact you took some time out for us. We understand the schedule is very busy, and we thank you for that.
I get paid to communicate with my constituents, and this is one way of doing it.
Well, it's good to have you back again.
Yeah.
I wanted to start with a question you've probably been asked many times, and that is why? 83 years old, why not just ride off into the sunset? Nice
Yeah.
long career,
Thank you.
highly thought of, won every election he's ever run in. Why not say, that's enough.
Yeah.
Why do this again?
Before I answer your question, can I do something that I should do out of courtesy to you folks to thank you for this opportunity to talk to my constituents? And then, since I believe that this is an interview about endorsements, I think it'd be wrong if I didn't tell you I would appreciate the endorsement and consideration for endorsement. I like working for the people of Iowa. I want to continue to work for people of Iowa. There's a lot of work to be done. And I would say in 3 areas I try to do that work. One is jobs for Iowans, as best evidenced by my work. Just one example, my work on the wind energy production tax credit as an example, creating 7,000 jobs in Iowa, 31% of the energy in Iowa coming from wind. What I do in the area of exports and export policy as an example. The second one would be I spend a great deal of my time, some people might say too much time, on accountability in government. An example of that accountability in government, besides all the investigations I do, and my staff reminds me that I probably have written at least 500 letters asking for information from various government agencies as part of my job of investigation, which leads to accountability and most often transparency, because transparency is a forerunner of accountability in government. But one example of that is the legislation that I got passed called the False Claims Act that has brought $48 billion back into the federal treasury. And then thirdly, and lastly, something I grouped together as security, but I'd say it falls into 2 areas. One, national security. The number one responsibility of the federal government is to provide for the national security of the American people. And now with the war on terror, that involves internal security as well as against foreign governments that threaten us. And then personal and economic security is an environment that creates jobs. That's personal security, but it's also economic security for the entire nation. Those are 3 areas, and I suppose there's a lot of other areas, or you could probably dissect them into several subgroups. But the point is that those are 3 areas that I've always emphasized and run for re-election. I like working for the people of Iowa, and there's more to do.
Was it at all a difficult decision, or was it an easy decision?
It was a very easy decision. Yeah.
No going back and forth. It was, I'm running again. It was an easy decision for you. No second thoughts about,
No,
that's enough. Maybe I'll just retire and
No.
call it a career.
no second thoughts.
All due respect in this question, I'm sure it's a question you get from other people, and that is, you are 83 years old. What about Iowans who say 6-year term, demanding job, demanding
Yeah.
schedule? Is he up to that?
Is that
Another 6 years?
Yeah.
And what do you say to them to that?
I run 3 miles 4 times a week, and once a year on my birthday, I run 6 miles from the home to the dome. I did that again this year.
So no one should have any question or doubts about
Well,
the capacity to meet the demanding schedule of a United States Senator for a
I
6-year term.
I arrive at the office at 6 in the morning, maybe sometimes 6:15. I leave at about 7 or 7:15 at night.
This is another question. Obviously, you've been asked this many times, but we haven't had an opportunity to ask it. So, You took some heat earlier this year, probably still continue to take some heat about the Supreme Court vacancy and the Garland nomination.
Yeah.
Why not give the man a fair hearing?
Sure.
Barack Obama is still the president, and he has the responsibility to nominate someone, which he did. Why not give the man, the nominee, a vetting, a fair hearing? Why push that off and say, we're going to let the people decide? Because didn't the people decide to elect Barack Obama president and vest him with that responsibility of nominating someone?
Let me address your last point first, because that's one of the reasons I get from my constituents of moving forward with it. The president has a 4-year term. The president himself said in before the 2014 interim election, he said, this is a referendum on my agenda. I think the people gave Republican majority in the United States Senate because of the fact that it was a referendum on his agenda, and he said after the November election that he saw that election as a rejection of that agenda. So, filling a Supreme Court vacancy has two parts. One, what the president does to nominate, and what the Senate does to confirm. So we feel very secure that we're representing the will of the electorate of 2014 that the president said was a rejection of his agenda. So we are a check on the presidency. The second thing is, getting back to a hearing, probably I did not give the typical speeches that Democrat presidents gave when we had, Democrat senators gave when we had Republican presidents. 87, 92, 2007, various Democrat senators spoke very clearly that if there's a vacancy in the last year of a Republican presidency, then it should be filled by the new president. That was said by Biden, 87, said by Biden, 92. It was said by Schumer, 2007, 18 months before George W. Bush was leaving office. I didn't give such a speech until after Scalia died. But the same principle holds true. You can't have one rule for Republican presidents and another rule for Democrat presidents. So we decided as a committee, first of all, me as chairman of the committee, and then all 11 Republican members of the committee, that we should follow that understanding that previously was enunciated or proven by history when LBJ had a vacancy for justice on the Supreme Court, and the Senate said, we aren't going to approve it in your last year. So Nixon ended up appointing 2 people to the Supreme Court after he was elected.
No concern, this is politicizing something that ought not be politicized. I understand everything in Washington is politicized to one extent or another, but no concern about playing a little political football game here with something that's important.
I think we'll get into the issue of is everything in Washington politics when you get me a chance to ask me about things that I do in a bipartisan way in Washington, which is most of my work. No more concern than a speech that Senator Reid gave in 2005 when there was a Supreme Court vacancy up. It was finally approved by the Senate, but he spoke that there's nothing in the United States Constitution that says Congress has to act.
Is there any concern, you can see the polls in the presidential race, where most people think that, Clinton has an advantage now, that if she's elected and if the Republicans are having to hold the majority, that, or if the Democrats would take, that's still up in the air, that you could wind up with a less palatable nominee than Garland next year, as far ideology wise,
in America,
also a much younger nominee, which would be on the court even longer than he would.
Yeah, in America, when you take a position, you have to respect the results of that election, and who's ever elected and sworn in on January 20th will have to accept their nominee, or under our advice and consent, the advice part of it, we've got plenty of opportunity to give our advice to the president ahead of time. In fact, we gave advice to the president before he nominated Garland. He doesn't have to take our advice, and he didn't take our advice and went ahead and nominated, but he knew what we were going to do. So we gave advice, it wasn't accepted, and we can have an opportunity to advise the new president, Republican or Democrat. And if we have a Republican president, I intend to give my advice the same way as I would if we had a Democrat president. But you have to accept the will of the majority. That's why I tell people that this isn't an election just for the next 4 years for who's going to be president of the United States, but following on your question, it's going to give direction to the Supreme Court probably for the next 40 years. So that's why this election, and that's why this campaign, both between Hillary and Trump, should give a great deal of attention to the Supreme Court issue, because there's not only the vacancy that's there now, but there's possibly 2 or 3 other vacancies, considering the possible retirement of people right now that are even talking about retirement, or other people are talking about their retirement. See? So it's a very important election. In fact, I just recently read an article, I don't know what publication it was in, but within the last week, about this, who was elected president this time, is going to change the direction of the Supreme Court. It didn't say for 40 years like I did, but the biggest change since the 1968 presidential election. And I've already referred to that because LBJ nominee was not taken up to be Chief Justice, and then that justice that was going to be promoted resigned, so Nixon actually had 2 vacancies to fill.
Just a procedural question on this whole issue, and then I wanted to move on to the election as well. So when Barack Obama leaves office, the person he nominated, that nomination is dead, correct? I mean, it doesn't carry over unless the new president chooses the same person. That ends when Obama's term in office ends? Is that how that works?
Yeah, I'm sure it would work the same way for Supreme Court justices, just like it does for justices that are on the calendar at the end of a calendar year, whether it's the first year or the second year of a Congress. They go back to the White House and they have to be sent back.
Right.
But I suppose the answer is they're more effectively dead when the president's leaving office.
Right.
But he could resubmit Garland on January the 4th if he wanted to, when the new Congress takes up. But I think he's going, as a practical matter, if Hillary's elected president, I presume he's going to have some deference to her.
Sure. But there's no automatic carryover.
No.
Depends
No.
on the president, who's in office, who made the choice. There's no carryover from one president to the next.
Yeah, let me be clear that usually, like I said, at the end of the year, if there's something on the calendar and they haven't been proven, they go back. They generally, immediately, most of them would come back to the Congress. They don't have to, if they've had a hearing and they've been voted out of committee, they usually don't have to go through that process.
The election then. Just share with us your overall thoughts about your party's nominee for president, Donald Trump. In a general sense, and then I've got a couple of, I don't want to sit here and have you respond to every position he's taken on every issue, certainly. But in a general sense first, and then I had 2 specific issues I wanted to get your take on his position. But let's just start in a general sense. What do you like about him? What do you maybe not like about him? What do you think of him as your party's nominee as a whole?
He is our party's nominee, and I said that I would support him. Said that a long time ago. But usually when I look at whoever's running for president, I look at how it relates to me as a United States Senator. I'm a member of a different branch of government. I have responsibilities. I know that a president proposes, Congress disposes, and with every president, Republican or Democrat, probably more so with Democrat presidents than Republican presidents. But when I agree with them, I work with them, and when I disagree with them, I have to do what a senator that takes an oath to uphold the Constitution has to do. So maybe I'd have more agreement with a Republican president than a Democrat president. But for instance, in regard to Obama, it didn't keep me from working very closely with him on criminal justice reform or sentencing reform or whatever you want to call it, as an example. A very bipartisan, important bill that got out of my committee that some people would say the biggest criminal justice reform in a quarter century, as an example. So I don't think too much, because I have to look at whatever any president proposes, independent of that individual, and deal with the issues. When you agree with them, you work with them, and when you disagree with them, you do what you do to represent the people of Iowa.
What about the personality side of it? What about some of the controversial stuff he says and how he conducts himself in a personal way? I look at you and I think about your career and how you talk to people and how you talk about people and how you've always been on a high level with you respect people, you don't denigrate people. That's sort of been your whole career. And here's a man who almost on a daily basis is alienating some voter bloc, some group of Americans. And I'm just interested to know, given how you've conducted yourself, what do you think about that side of Donald Trump? Not the issue side, but the personality side.
Well, just to tell people, I think every person in the country has value. They ought to be treated as an individual, as somebody with value, and that's kind of how I do things, and I expect other people to do it the same way. The difficulty with me commenting on anything that he says or does, I can see it in a very narrow area of what he said this day or that day, but I don't know him as an individual. People that do know him as an individual says he very much listens. He's very easy to get along with. He's a person that pays attention to you, and if you're talking to him, you're the most important person in the world. But I've never had that sort of a relationship with him that makes it possible. I see his political persona and as a candidate, but I don't know him as an individual to make that judgment, see. I've served with different presidents. I felt like President Reagan was probably the best president I've served with, but I think as an individual, after I got to know George W. Bush, I felt like I knew George W. Bush better than any president as a personality than any of them I served with, see. And I think you have to know people that personally to really answer your question.
Have you spent much time with him? I know he's been on the Hill a few times.
He
as a judiciary chairman, and he would be responsible for, if he's elected, naming someone for you to consider as a Supreme Court justice. Have you spent any amount of time with him, talking to him when he's been up on the Hill?
Well, I can tell you of two instances. One time, about 25 minutes, he was with a group of about 20 senators in the annual retreat that we have at Williamsburg, Virginia, in June. I was there with other senators. I didn't say anything. A lot of senators talked to him. Then the first week after the 4th of July break, there was about an hour he spent with about 40 senators on the Hill. Again, every senator wants to get in their point.
Hard to get a one-on-one with 40 senators.
One-on-one with him in Pella 5 minutes before I introduced him. You know, at the weekend before the caucuses, I made a point of introducing 11 different candidates to their audience in at least 6 different cities around Iowa. And I spent 5 minutes with him at that particular time before I spoke to the crowd about his candidacy.
So not a lot of
No.
of that close-up, one-on-one
No.
interaction with
Yeah.
the man to get a sense of him
Yeah.
in terms of his personality and
Yeah.
etc. Two specific issues that he's talked about that I wanted to get your take on, and then I'll move on from him. One is what do you think about when he talks about how bad our trade deals have been, and two in particular, the NAFTA agreement and the TPP agreement, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't those, or wouldn't they be, NAFTA in the past tense, TPP in the future sense, good for farmers and agriculture in Iowa? So is he wrong on those trade deals? And the other is Putin.
See.
He's consistently, on almost a daily basis, praising Vladimir Putin
Yeah.
in one way or another. Do you share his positions on trade deals and on Putin?
The way I look at trade deals is this way. When before we negotiate, most of the rest of the world we're negotiating with have high tariffs. And we have consistently, in the last 50, 60 years, had relatively low tariffs. Sometimes, compared to the rest of the world, very low. So I see any opportunity that we get to reduce tariffs in other countries down closer to what ours is, or equal, or doing away with all tariffs, I think is a win-win for American manufacturing. So for Iowa, I would say, John Deere tractors, 24% are exported from Waterloo. Vermeer in Pella, about 30% of their heavy equipment is exported. For 3M in Knoxville, not heavy stuff, products, about 40% is exported. Principal Financial has a great deal of financial services business overseas. It's good for Principal Financial. And then for agriculture, we've always used the rule of thumb that about 1/3 of our agricultural products are exported because we produce more than we do. So I look at trade agreements reducing, having a level playing field for American producers and workers being a good thing. Now, I don't think we've done enough when there's been a direct relationship between trade and people losing their jobs. That more needs to be done in that area. So the extent to which Trump has a different view, I would say that he says he wants free trade. He believes in trade. I think that where he needs to tell the American people is it's not only free trade, but fair trade. And that's what all of us want. And then he talks about raising tariffs. And I think that confuses people. He'd be better off if he used the terms countervailing duties, because legally under our laws, he can do almost anything he wants to. The trouble is both Republican and Democrat presidents have been timid in doing it. So people see jobs going overseas, they don't see free trade being fair trade. So when China, for instance, subsidizes a product and dumps it in the United States, the president has the authority to put on countervailing duties that would level the playing field. And that's what Mr. Trump ought to be talking about, instead of saying we're going to put a 40% tariff on products coming out of China. Just say we're going to level the playing field under existing law. Or in the case of non-tariff trade barriers, like we'll say this would be our food products, our phytosanitary and sanitary rules that we have under the World Trade Agreements. We can take them to arbitration real easy, and that's what I would suggest he talk about, taking the stuff, so that we know the laws guarantee free trade. Presidents haven't, both Republican and Democrat, haven't been aggressive enough doing that. And he would show, I think what he's trying to do is show the American people that he would be very aggressive in doing that. I just don't think he uses the right language.
But are you concerned, I mean, you were talking about, you know, obviously Iowa benefits maybe more than even some other states with all the different manufacturers and with, you know, the commodities and so forth. But his message to the average person probably seems like that trade is bad and all the trade agreements that have been signed over the years need to be ripped up. But he doesn't seem to talk about how it benefits companies like the you know, many here in Iowa that you mentioned.
Yeah. Well, I think the bottom line of it is that when he talks about he's going to negotiate better deals and he's a good business negotiator, I think if he would stress that point more and how he's going to do it would make it more clear where he's coming from. Because he said flat out, he is for trade. And he wants trade. And he knows you gotta have it.
He said that NAFTA was the biggest disaster trade deal that America's ever done. He said that in the last debate. Do you agree with him on that?
I think I've made my point pretty clear that when countries like Mexico have higher tariffs than we do, and then we negotiate those tariffs down, I think that it has benefited our trade with Mexico.
Do you support the TPP?
The 3,000 pages, I've never completely read yet. I've read the agricultural parts of it. And by the way, if you want to know why I haven't read all 3,000 pages, because I'm going to have plenty of time to read that when and if it comes up, but it looks like the way this presidential campaign's going, it's never going to come up, regardless of which one of the two are elected. But on agriculture, it is very, very good. I take that not only from my own reading, but because of the positions taken by all the commodity groups and all but one general agriculture group in Iowa. There is some qualms within dairy about it, but they aren't opposed to it. So let me go back and say where I do have some concerns about TPP. They deal with what we call intellectual property rights, and those being maybe some of our existing laws being compromised on intellectual property. That I think if we get an opportunity to go back to the table, some of those things ought to be dealt with. Now, are those enough for me to vote no? I have not come to that conclusion.
How about him on Putin? Does he praise Putin too much? What's your take on his consistently praising? He says he's a better leader than Barack Obama, and he seems quite taken with Vladimir Putin.
I think Vladimir Putin wants to reestablish the old Soviet Union. He'll never get the job done, but that's his goal, and that's bad.
So you wouldn't agree with Trump's consistent praising of him? You think he's a little more of a concern than Mr.
Well,
Trump
I surely hope in Trump praising him that he's not agreeing with these policies. He just simply said, I think he's a strong leader. And as far as I'm concerned, he's too strong of a leader. And he's trying to be a stronger leader. He's trying to be a Joseph Stalin again.
Senator, how well did you work with Secretary Clinton when she was in the Senate? Were you close? Did you do things together, or what was the relationship?
I think she served on the Budget Committee, which has most of its work in the first 3 months of the year. And so you don't get acquainted with people. So at none of the other committees she served on did I serve with her. But there was never a time that I had a bad relationship with her. That doesn't mean that we were communicating all the time, but when we did communicate, it was always a worthwhile and congenial sort of communication.
Do you think you could work with her if she were elected, or?
I can work with any president because, see, the way our constitutional system is set up, I have responsibility that's entirely different than the president. So pretty much like I previously have answered, who's ever president, Republican or Democrat, I'm going to work with them when I can, and when I disagree with them, I'll take a separate route. But even where I generally agree with them, there may be changes that have to be made. So you got to remember, a president proposes and Congress disposes. And that's the constitutional difference. So I have to look at it from my first Article 1 rights, the legislative functions of the Congress.
Can I ask, what do you make of all of this kind of situation that we see now? I mean, this is the most bizarre presidential election we've ever had. And it becomes name calling, it becomes all these kind of things that I thought elected people were above. You've been in office for a long time, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of these kinds of things. What can we make of all of this? What does this mean? Is it something about our people today? Is it something about the way civility has changed? What is it?
First of all, I think that campaigns, whether for the United States Senate or for the presidency, ought to be run strictly on policy. Secondly, there may be a little less civility within our society as a whole, but presidential candidates should not reflect that. They ought to set a very high standard. Then, when it comes to an explanation for it, I think I would kind of answer your question similar to when this comes up this way in my meetings around Iowa. They say, why can't you guys get along? They're talking about 535 people, and they think Republicans never speak to Democrats. That's not right, at least in the United States Senate. Everybody's congenial to everybody else. When you're speaking on the floor and you have ideological differences, it sounds. So I don't want to put something on your back as a journalist, but you do know the principle that controversy makes news. And if people are getting along, it doesn't make news. So I always use several examples of things I've been involved in as where you can get along. Like, for instance, I've been chairman of the Judiciary Committee now almost 2 years. All 30 bills that have come out of committee have been bipartisan bills. 12 now, I think 13 this week, signed by the president. And I think of the 30 bills, 18 of them have gone through the Senate. Now, the Judiciary Committee has some of the most liberal members of the Senate on the left and some of the most conservative members on the right. And surely Senator Leahy and I are ideologically different. But I just gave you a figure on the working of the committee, see? But if Leahy and I were fighting all the time, like you might say it was on the judgeship thing, the justice thing, then that makes news. But you don't pay any attention when 30 bills get out of committee that are bipartisan, 13 of them signed by the president. So, and I could give you other examples. I talked about the bill, the legislation I got passed that brought $48 billion into the federal treasury. A Democrat, Congressman Berman, not in the Senate House now, and I worked together on that for 2 years and 30 years ago. I got Senator Kennedy and I worked for 6 years to get the Family Opportunity Bill passed. That's to help people in middle income that can't get Medicaid, to help them if they got special needs children. Or I worked with Baucus. When I was chairman of the Finance Committee, he was the ranking Democrat. Later he was chairman when they were in the majority to get Part D passed for Medicare prescription drugs, as an example. You know, I could give you maybe a lot of other examples, but you can work together if you got an intent to do it. Now, everybody thinks things are partisan because in the House of Representatives, if the majority party sticks together, they can ignore the minority. But the institution of the United States Senate forces people to work together when you have this 60-vote thing and you only have 54 of one party. See? Oh, I was only giving you the results of everything. You get back to how do you get to this position where you are? You know, 30 years ago, NBC, CBS, ABC controlled 80% of the news. I think they say they control about 20% now. And you didn't have the internet. There's not a single political opinion that you want out, any individual wants out. If they got access to the internet, they can get it out. You've got conservative talk show, you got liberal talk show, you got Fox News, you got MSNBC. So at the grassroots of America, the country's more ideologically divided. If you go back to the presidential campaigns of, let's say, the 80s and early 90s, you had, let's say, 35% of the people are going to be Democrat, 35% are going to be for the Republican. You were fighting over the other 30%. Today, since the grassroots are so ideologically divided, it's probably fighting over 5 to 10%, and probably closer to 5%, to get that undecided vote. Because people are so tuned in to either being for this person or that person, right or left, you know. So that's where we are. And now, I don't think that that's a cause of our incivility. And I think we're still a very civilized society compared to a lot of countries. And we set a darn good example for the rest of the world. But I think that's part of the rationale for it.
My next question is on an issue that's important to you, it's important to Iowa, and that's renewable energy. More specifically, ethanol and the RFS, the wind energy tax credits. Where are we going with those? Will they eventually, I imagine, be phased out? And how long before they would be phased out? The RFS seems to be something that the fight grows to keep it in place each year.
Yeah.
It's gotten a lot of discussion this year with, particularly with Senator Cruz as a presidential candidate, not a big fan of the RFS. Where do you see the RFS wind energy tax credits going?
Okay, I'll have to handle each one of them separately. If Senator Toomey and Senator Alexander had listened to us 3 years ago, wind energy would probably be phased out right now. They wanted to phase it out. They wanted to do away with it right then. The Wind Energy Association said if we can have a 5-year look ahead, we'll be mature enough, we can get along without it. Well, that didn't happen until last December. It goes to 2020, and then we won't have any wind energy tax incentive. Solar will be 2021, we won't have any. We've already done away with the tax incentive for ethanol, so we have the RFS. The RFS is permanent law until 2021 or 22. And as long as we have 41 votes in the United States Senate to keep anybody from compromising that, we will be able to keep it. After 21, 22, it's too early for me to tell you what the situation will be then. If it needs to be kept, I'll fight to keep it. If it does, maybe can go away like the others. But I think that right now I'd have to say we're going to need it, considering the power of big oil. Then on biodiesel, before December 31st, we have to renew that tax credit. Geothermal. There's several alternative energies that we have to renew. Another one would be the cellulosic ethanol credit. Will have to go on for a few years. But nobody ever passes these incentives to think that they're going to be there forever. It's to get an infant industry started, and when it's mature, it goes away. As I just said, for solar, wind,
What was the year for solar when that phases out?
2021. See,
Wind in 2020.
yeah. And that's going to be 100% this year, 100% next year, and then 80% and 60% and 40%. That may not work out right, but it's going to be phased out, so the incentive goes down a little bit and then done away with in 2020, I think. See, and then, but I think you have to. You're asking about energy. I think you have to think in terms of a comprehensive energy program, and that isn't just alternative energy. It's to continue to use fossil fuels as long as they need to be used. It includes all alternative energy, more than what you and I've talked about here, and it includes conservation, both personal and conservation that may be promoted by various government laws or regulations, and then nuclear energy. So I think you have to have all four if you want to have what you call a comprehensive energy program.
Former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords was in Iowa yesterday, and she was talking about gun control. So I wanted to ask you this morning, is she wrong about the need for more stronger gun control measures in this country? Where do you stand, Second Amendment, gun control,
Yeah.
that whole topic?
Yeah.
A lot of discussion about gun violence.
Let me answer your first question about, I think there's a need to make sure have mental issues can't get guns. And it's not just as simple as passing a law to get that job done, because of the HIPAA legislation, the medical privacy legislation, and getting that information out and getting it into the data bank. There's also some people that are in the data bank that can't buy guns for the simple reason, if they're in the VA and they need a third party to handle their finances, it's assumed that they have some mental issue. Their name has gone to the FBI files, so they can't buy guns. That's wrong. So there's some people that have their names on the list that shouldn't have their names on the list. But there's considering the mental issues behind a lot of people that have been involved in these casualties we've had around the country, these school shootings and college shootings and all that, most of those people have had mental issues that shouldn't have been able to buy guns in the first place. We've at least gone in that direction. And then to answer your more general and really a more basic question is, the Second Amendment under Supreme Court decisions applies to individuals, just like it does military control of guns. And the Second Amendment is as much a part of the Bill of Rights as the First Amendment or the Fourth Amendment or any other Bill of Rights you want to do, and ought to be respected in the same way. There isn't one article in the Bill of Rights that's got more weight than the other.
Immigration reform, illegal immigration, that problem. Talk a little bit about what your approach to that problem is, what parts of immigration reform you're supportive of, and more specifically, is Congress going to pass Sarah's law, the Iowa woman?
I hope so.
Sarah Root. So do I.
But I'll bet it'll have, if we have just 3 weeks between the election and Christmas to be in session, my guess is you won't get very many things like that up, but I sure hope we can. Just like I hope we get Kate's law passed as another example of a law that should be passed. Securing the border, and I'm not talking just about Mexico, but securing the border and at the airports with an exit entry system and interior enforcement are all necessary predecessors to passing a immigration bill. based on the proposition that people don't trust Congress about controlling the borders when we talk about it. And that's why it's difficult to get an immigration bill passed. So I think establishing credibility with the people is a necessary forerunner of it. There's a lot of legal immigration bills we could pass right now, but Democrats in the Senate take the position that you ought to pass a comprehensive immigration bill, which is one great big package of legal and dealing with undocumented workers together. And it's difficult to get things like that through the House of Representatives, so I think you have to deal with separate bills. So in legal immigration, the professional people that we call H-1Bs, the unskilled workers, and the agricultural workers, I think we could pass those legislation now if we didn't have to deal with a comprehensive piece of legislation. So that's kind of where we are.
So the reality is a comprehensive, broad-based immigration discussion and bill is probably not in the cards for next year, regardless of how the election turns out.
Yeah,
It's a more effective approach to attack different
Yeah.
components on an individual bill basis, in
Yeah.
estimation, because the other is probably not going to happen.
Yes.
I'm interested to know what we're an agriculture state, and the issue of climate change, of course, is something much discussed. And in a farm state, I'm interested to know what your position on climate change is, and are you at all concerned about the potential impact of climate change on the future farmers of our agriculture state? We just had some flooding over in eastern Iowa again, of course. Some people point to these more severe weather occurrences as being the result of climate change. Droughts are longer, flooding is worse, etc. Could have a huge impact on an agriculture state in the future if, in fact, that's true, as most scientists believe it is. What's your take on the issue of climate change?
We have climate change. I'm not sure that I can discuss the impact on agriculture except as it gets warmer. The seasons for corn and soybeans move further north. I don't know the extent to which I don't know the economic impact of that I can answer your question there, but I know I've read enough about it that that's happening. I think the most one solution to global warming, climate change, is for a tax on fossil fuels, and the extent to which you have that. And agriculture is so dependent upon energy to grow the food so that we have food for national security and for social cohesion, so we don't have riots in America like they do in some countries. That's why federal policy on agriculture is so important for national security and for social cohesion, that you get back to the cost of energy to produce it, that I think that's the only solution that I've seen to global warming that's bad for agriculture.
But you subscribe, I mean, you believe the science, you agree, you acknowledge global warming and climate change is a reality.
You can
Some don't.
You can quantify.
It's a hoax, essentially.
You can quantify it. I mean, the temperature's gone up. There might be some dispute how much of it's natural, how much of it is man-made. The only thing that I would question scientists, and I'm not sure it's the scientists that are saying it, it may be politicians saying it for scientists or misinterpreting scientists, but the people that say there's no dispute whatsoever about natural versus human. The whole essence of science is to always question. And so people that say that you can't ask any questions, I think are not scientific. I mean, that's the essence of science, to always be asking questions
Yes.
and always reviewing each other's work.
We had Kim Weaver, who's running against Steve King, here yesterday. And one thing she said to me, or to us, that surprised me, and I'll ask you the same question. She said not one single person, no one, on the campaign trail so far, has asked her a single question about the federal debt. Is that your experience on
No.
the campaign trail? Are you hearing about our
No.
$20 trillion in federal debt? Are you hearing from Iowans about their concern about the federal debt? And
No.
how and when will Washington ever come to grips with that?
There's hardly a county meeting that I have, and that could be an open county meeting. It could be a factory floor where I go where workers can't come to me. It could be to go to high schools because I never get any young people coming to my open town meetings. Or it could be a Rotary Club where I don't get professional people to come to my town meetings. So I try to go around and when people don't come to me, I try to go to them. And I don't know whether it's 70 or 80% of the time. It isn't 100% of the time. But it comes up something like this. When are you guys ever going to balance the budget? See?
So your experience is opposite of
Yeah.
what she told us.
Yeah.
So you hear that from
Yeah,
Iowa. What do you say to them then? What's your answer?
okay. First of all, I try to be very open that the first solution I'm going to give them isn't going to take care of the immediate problem. But I support a constitutional amendment requiring a balanced budget. I've had a chance to vote for that 2 or 3 times since I've been in the Senate. One time it came within 1 vote of passing. And the reason I say that is because I've served in the Iowa legislature. 46 states have such requirements, and I think it's a good discipline. Beyond that, I think you have to take the number one responsibility of the federal government and treat it a little bit differently because only the federal government protects the American people on our national security, our defense, and stuff like that. And that's not, you know my reputation, that's not like saying you give defense all they want, because I've been one of the biggest critics of defense waste and all that sort of stuff, but making sure that it's spent wisely. But then everything else you're going to have to look at on an individual basis and make proper adjustments. The only thing that I would say that I would take disagreement with is people say you got to raise taxes. I wouldn't want to say that you never raise taxes, but here's what happens on a 50-year average. You raise taxes $1, and it seems to give Congress a license to spend $1.13. So if I raise taxes and went to the bottom line, it would be one thing. But if it's going to lead to more spending beyond the $1 additional dollar you bring in, it doesn't make sense. So that brings me back to the problem that we have a spending problem. We don't have a taxing problem. And my taxing philosophy is to keep taxes kind of within the 18.5% to 20% range that they've been for 50 years, based on the proposition that there hasn't been a revolt against that level of taxation, and it hasn't hurt the economy.
When you take the temperature of the Congress, do you feel at all a willingness to address the debt problem, or do you, in all reality, foresee it just sort of slowly continuing as it is, status quo?
Yeah. Now it's the latter, but let me tell you, 13, 14, and 15 under sequestration, and stay into sequestration for those 3 years. I felt a real determination to do something about it. In fact, it made progress. We got the annual deficit down from about 9 or 10% of gross national product down to what it is right now, I think 2.64% of gross national product. But then what happened in 15? You had Americans beheaded. ISIS took over the vacuum that was created in Iraq because Obama took our troops, 100% of our troops out. There was a vacuum there. ISIS, you get all this threat to Americans being captured and beheaded and everything. And then all of a sudden, you spend more money, have to spend more money on defense. And then what happens for a political compromise in Washington? Well, if you're going to spend $1 more on defense, we got to spend $1 more on domestic programs. I'm not sure what the relationship is, considering the constitutional responsibility of the federal government to provide for national security, but that's the political scheme you get into. So instead of just spending $40 billion more on defense over a 2-year period of time, we're spending $40 billion more on domestic programs as well. And you never provide for the defense the way you should, and other things happen as a result. So for 17, and now that same program's going to go on for 18. For 16, that was the case, and now it's going to go on for what we're doing right now in the budget for 17. Then presumably for 18, you go back to sequestration. But will we go back to sequestration?
Right.
That's the question.
I haven't asked a national security question, and I want to get one in before we.
What kind of a question?
A national security question. I haven't
Oh,
asked any national
yeah.
security questions. So before we wrap up, I want to get one in, and I'll pose it this way. And what obviously terrorism is on the list, but in addition to terrorism, what concerns you? What parts of the world, what countries do you worry about with respect to America's national security? Where do you think our biggest concerns are with respect to our own domestic security?
They would go where our, it's not limited to our treaty obligations, but at least our treaty obligations ought to have primary concern. Russia challenging NATO, North Korea challenging South Korea. Now those two are treaty obligations. Iran's threat to wipe Israel off the map. We don't have, I don't think we have a treaty with Israel, but we feel a moral obligation to help Israel.
What do we need to do?
Oh, no, I've got to mention, I'm sorry, I need to mention a fourth one. And I don't, it may be too early to worry about this, but there's people in our national security and defense that are worried about it. China's activity in the South China Sea.
What can we do, what should we do as a country to protect the homeland from acts of terrorism perpetrated by ISIS and other world terrorist organizations? What do we need to do that we haven't done? What steps do you support, do you think are necessary? Or are we just going to continue to see these incidents of terrorism pop up?
There's the FBI in open hearing before my committee says that there's 900 people that we have to surveil because of things that they've said that show sympathy to ISIS overseas or carrying out ISIS goals here. And there's at least one in every state. Now, I always use the 900 figure, but I read something else that somebody else said that we got 7,000 people to worry about. But I don't know where that figure comes from. Now, we have probably, the last figure I saw, and it may not be a current figure, arrested 105, and a lot of them had been charged and convicted of either sympathy to ISIS overseas or wanting to carry out ISIS activity back here. Yet we've had 5 incidents like Orlando and Chattanooga and Boston and Fort Hood and San Bernardino, where 95 Americans have died. So this has got to be considered a serious threat. And I guess number one don't do anything to cripple the FBI in their work. And I should give credit to a lot of local police departments have pretty good terrorist surveillance operations going as well. I think New York City would be easy. It'd be easy to point out New York City. Beyond that, I'm not sure I can, but I'm sure that they're all working together on this. So I think some people in Congress would like to weaken what the FBI can do in surveillance for national security reasons. Then to make sure they got adequate resources and let them do their job. And the reason I say let them do their job with some confidence, you can say they've been wrong 5 times because 95 people have died, but if they've stopped 105 others or more from doing what they wanted to do, and the most obvious one is probably now 5-6 years ago, a guy traveling from Colorado for Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve in New York City to unload to blow up that part of the city with the stuff already in the car, and they tracked him and followed him. That's an example of some of their success. I can't tell you all 105. Some of them probably more dangerous than others, you know.
What about what Donald Trump
Well,
said
there's
about
one.
Muslims entering the country?
Well, I'll answer your question, but you ask it again after I say something I just forgot to say. In regard to not only their resources, but we also have to have confidence that the FBI can do their work and do it properly. So let's say in the case of the Boston bomber, they went back to Chechnya for a period of time. They were not tracked, but they had already been questioned before they went back. Then the guy in Orlando had gone back to I don't know which one was his home country, went back. And then the guy that just did the bombing without casualty, well, there were some casualties in New York City and New Jersey, he had gone. So the question comes up, like I asked last week in our Judiciary Committee when Sessions Subcommittee on Immigration was having a hearing on this subject. I said, you don't track these people back. Why aren't you tracking them? Well, the immediate answer I got from the Department of Homeland Security, well, that's an FBI issue. See, let the FBI, it's law enforcement. Well, they were misleading because the FBI can't do it if Homeland Security and the State Department also has a responsibility in it. If they get a visa to go home or they're traveling out of the country, if the FBI isn't notified. See, as an example. Now, you asked me about the others.
Donald Trump talks about a ban on Muslims from certain parts of the world where there's terrorism and where there's a threat of terrorism coming into our country, and that we ought not be allowing Muslims from those areas of the world into our country until we can vet them better than we are able to today.
There's 2 answers to it. One, when he first said it, it was like he was going to keep people out because of their religious faith.
Right.
You can't do that under our Constitution. Now, I think he realizes, and he's backed off of that. I think he's closer, well, I shouldn't say where he is. I can tell you where I am. I think we ought to stay immigration under a refugee program from those countries until, I shouldn't say those countries, that part of the world where they have threatened to bring terrorists in to do harm to Americans. If they hadn't made that threat, we wouldn't even be talking about it. So there's a real threat there that's evidenced by some of the things people have already said in this country. Now, delay until the FBI and the intelligence community can certify we got a vetting process. Because the FBI director appeared before our committee and said that we don't have a perfect vetting system.
Can I jump in with something different? You are on the forefront of protecting our medicines, our pharmaceuticals, and keeping the prices down. How difficult is that battle? And what went wrong? Why is it that we're seeing these companies jack up the prices to outrageous sums?
There's probably several answers. It'd be better for me to give you some of my solutions because I'm not sure it's possible to give an answer of why one company does something and another company does something. In the case of Mylan, it's quite obvious they have a monopoly. So then what do? Not only do I write a letter to Mylan complaining about that, and I want to know what their process is and their justification and all that sort of stuff, and we aren't done with that yet. Although they did answer our letter, and we did have a briefing by the company before our committee staff, and then the House had an open hearing on it, and they got hit from both Republican and Democrat sides. So I wrote, because the best answer to that problem is not to have a monopoly, but to have competition. So Teva had a product that FDA didn't approve. Why? What's in the pipeline to come that we can have competition, and that sort of thing. So, but that's not really one of the three things I wanted to give you. One, it would be the importation of drugs. I have voted several times, and we've never got it to the President of the United States. Sometimes we got it through the Senate, but not the House of Representatives, and I don't know how many times, but I have voted for the importation of drugs. Because, well, maybe for a principle we have already talked about here. Do you know that drugs and Cuban cigars are the only thing you can't import? Any other product you want, anywheres in the world, you can buy it if you want to, but not pharmaceutical. So so it fits in with the principle of freer trade. Number two, we do all the research for the rest of the world, or maybe somebody would say 75% of it. So why do we do that? Well, the prices of your drugs Americans are paying is paying for most of that research. Why? Because they sell to Germany, let's say, and the state buys it. And they make just a little bit of a profit, but on a big quantity, and they still make a lot of money. But the Germans aren't paying for the research. So we import drugs, they got more competition, drive down the price of drugs here, then they're going to have to get their money from the Germans to do the research. So that's more importantly than just getting the price of drugs down, but competition helps. The second one is this scheme that I call it pay for play, where companies, their patent runs out, then they make a deal with the generic to keep their market off for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and they pay them for it. So they still got the benefit of their patent, even though the time has run out. Klobuchar and I are working on a bipartisan bill to do away with it. And then I'm not sure that I can explain to you REMS, but I have this bill in that goes under the acronym of CREATES, where people, if they want to put a generic out and they need information from the patent company, they can't get it. And presumably maybe the FDA doesn't even help them get it. It gives them the ability to go to court to get that information so they can get their product on the market sooner. And it's all kind of related to the safety of the product. But they got to get all this information to get approval by FDA. It takes, if they had to go out and get it on their own, maybe they couldn't afford to get it. They can get it from the other company, but companies don't give it to them.
Is it a frustrating battle for you?
Of course it's a frustrating battle. Yeah.
we're a little over our hour, so I'm gonna ask, unless anybody else has anything else, my wrap-up question, and that is, same
Do
wrap-up question.
we have any extra time we can give them?
No, we're already over, so
Oh,
this is good.
okay.
Same question I asked as a wrap-up to anybody we have in who's running for office, and that's an opportunity to make a small stump speech if you want. Why should Iowans return you to the Senate for another term?
When I get up in the morning, I work for Iowans. You know, that's basically the job of a United States Senator. Work for the people that you represent in your respective states. I like working for Iowans. I try to work in three main areas. Those three main areas would be basically creating jobs or the economy of Iowa. I try to do that in several ways. Let me mention a couple. One would be to make sure that we promote alternative energy. So let's say 6,000 or 7,000 jobs created as a result of my wind energy tax credit. The other way is, since Iowa's farmers, manufacturers, and service industries export so much, to make sure that we have good export policies so we can export the quality products that we produce here. Second area, I try to represent Iowans, making sure that they get their tax money's worth from the federal government. And I try to do that through my investigative authority I have. You might call it oversight authority, sometimes involving pieces of legislation. But basically, I want to make sure that the public's business is public, and that involves transparency. And when you have transparency in the public's business, then you have accountability by the people that are spending the taxpayers' money or carrying out the laws of our country. And an example of a piece of legislation I got passed involving accountability would be the False Claims Act, which has brought $48 billion of fraudulently secured tax money back into the federal treasury. The third area is to provide security for Iowans. First of all, the number one responsibility of the federal government is national security, to protect you from people that want to do harm to us. The second part of that would be what you call personal or economic security, creating jobs, but to make sure that our economic system works for the benefit of all people, not just the special interest. I want to continue to work for Iowans and would appreciate very much your vote November this year.